Isabella Hart had always dreamed of a life filled with excitement and luxury. Growing up, she never had much. Her family, though supportive, was modest, and she spent most of her youth working towards something bigger, something that would elevate her from the ordinary to the extraordinary. Her passion for fashion had been the one thing that anchored her through the turbulence of adolescence. And now, at 26, she was beginning to make a name for herself in the industry. She had secured a position at a prestigious design house, working on high-profile projects, and was finally starting to feel like she was on the path she had always wanted. Then came Alexander Carrington. He appeared like a flash of brilliance in her world, a man who seemed to glide through life with effortless charm. He was everything she had imagined: powerful, charismatic, and impossibly attractive. The first time they met, it was at an exclusive charity gala in the city. Isabella had been there for work, but Alexander had caught her attention the moment he walked into the room. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his presence commanded the room without him uttering a single word. His eyes met hers across the room, and there was an instant connection, a spark that was undeniable. The evening passed in a blur, but it wasn't until later, when they both ended up in the same conversation circle, that their paths truly crossed. Alexander was warm, engaging, and effortlessly funny. His stories about his international business ventures, philanthropic work, and the places he had traveled made Isabella feel both awed and curious. She wasn't the type to fall for the charm of a man like him easily, but there was something about him, something that made her feel like she could trust him, even though they had only just met. By the end of the night, Alexander asked for her number, a simple request that seemed almost too casual. Isabella hesitated, unsure of what it meant, but before she could second-guess herself, she found herself handing it over. That was the beginning of what seemed like the perfect whirlwind romance. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Alexander was as magnetic in private as he was in public, and Isabella quickly found herself swept into his world. His life was everything she had never imagined for herself: luxury, power, and adventure. He took her to the best restaurants, to private parties, and on impromptu trips to places like Paris and the Amalfi Coast. Everything about her life with him felt like a dream, and she couldn't help but feel like the luckiest woman alive. For the first time, she felt like she was part of something truly exceptional. The connection between them deepened with every passing day. Alexander seemed to know exactly what Isabella needed, even before she did. He made her feel special, cherished, and seen. He was attentive in ways she had never known, showing up at her workplace with flowers, sending thoughtful texts at random moments, planning surprise getaways that seemed to be tailored to her every desire. It felt too good to be true, but it wasn't, or so she thought. To the outside world, their relationship was a fairy tale. Two stunning people in love, living a life of privilege and perfection. Alexander was a billionaire, a self-made man who owned multiple successful businesses, from tech startups to real estate developments. He was known for his philanthropic efforts, often seen at charity galas or appearing in the media alongside influential figures. Isabella, on the other hand, was an emerging star in the fashion world. Together, they made the kind of power couple that everyone wanted to be, or at least to know. Every event they attended, every dinner they shared, was like a scene from a magazine. People admired them from the outside, envied the way they seemed to have it all. But behind closed doors, Isabella started to notice small things that didn't quite add up. At first, they were easy to dismiss, slight oddities that could be explained away by the chaotic pace of Alexander's business life. He traveled often, sometimes for days at a time, and his work was demanding. But there were moments, especially when they were alone together, when his behavior seemed off. He would get quiet sometimes, his mind clearly elsewhere, and though he never spoke about it, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from her. It wasn't just the late-night phone calls, though there were plenty of those. Sometimes, when he'd come home from a business trip, he seemed almost too tired, too distant. When she asked about his day, he would offer vague responses, nothing specific. But it was when he would leave the room suddenly, when a phone call would interrupt a perfectly happy evening, or when he would stare off into the distance as though lost in thought, that the sense of something hidden grew stronger. Isabella knew him better than anyone. or so she thought, and yet there was always a part of him she couldn't quite reach. In those moments of doubt, Isabella would remind herself of the larger picture. The romantic getaways, the spontaneous gestures of affection, the way he would hold her close and make her feel like she was the most important person in the world. She told herself that perhaps her imagination was running wild. After all, no one's life was as perfect as it seemed. And yet, a voice inside her refused to let go of the feeling that there was something big, that Alexander wasn't telling her. She tried not to overthink it, but it was becoming harder to ignore. The cracks in the flawless exterior of their life together were beginning to show, and Isabella couldn't help but wonder what secrets Alexander was keeping. It was just a feeling at first, a nagging instinct that whispered to her in the quiet moments when they were alone together. It was a feeling she tried to bury, to dismiss as nothing more than a passing worry. But deep down, she knew that something was changing. The perfect world she had stepped into, the one that had felt so safe and so sure, was beginning to feel less certain. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, the feeling had started to build slowly, like a tiny crack in a pristine wall. At first, it was barely noticeable, a whisper of doubt that Isabella tried to push aside. But soon, it wasn't something she could ignore anymore. It happened one evening when they were attending a gala together. Alexander had been his usual charismatic self, charming everyone in the room with ease, while Isabella found herself quietly observing him. She was used to the way people gravitated toward him, the effortless way he commanded attention. It was part of the package, the suave billionaire, always impeccably dressed, his smile perfect. But that night, something about the way he interacted with a particular man in the crowd made her feel uncomfortable. There was a moment when they spoke privately, their words too soft for Isabella to overhear, but the body language between them spoke volumes. It wasn't the normal kind of friendly banter she had grown accustomed to. There was something tense about it, a level of familiarity that felt secretive. She shook it off, but as the night wore on, the feeling lingered. Later, when they were standing by the bar, Isabella noticed that Alexander's phone buzzed on the table next to him. He glanced at it, his face momentarily changing. It was subtle, but she caught it, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. It wasn't a look of interest or even surprise, but something closer to discomfort. He slid the phone face down before she could ask about it. And in that moment, Isabella's pulse quickened. What was it? A message from someone he didn't want her to see? Was it work-related, or was it something more personal? The unease grew, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being kept on the edge of something she wasn't meant to know. That night, as they made their way back to his penthouse, Isabella couldn't quite let go of the nagging feeling that had been building inside her all evening. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just her overactive imagination. Alexander, after all, was perfect. He had to be. She had known him long enough to trust him, right? Yet, when she entered the elevator beside him, his usual warmth seemed distant, almost like a mask. He smiled, of course, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. It was as if he was distracted, somewhere else entirely. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she felt like an outsider in his world for the first time. She was no longer just the woman by his side. She was an observer, unsure of her place in the life he had built. When they reached his apartment, the unease only deepened. Alexander went straight to the bar to pour himself a drink, as he often did after a long night. She watched him, her thoughts racing. Something wasn't right. She had known this man intimately for months, and yet tonight, she felt like a stranger. Without even thinking, she picked up his phone from the table and unlocked it. It was a moment of pure impulse, driven by that gnawing feeling that she couldn't shake. The phone revealed nothing, just work emails and messages from friends, nothing out of the ordinary. But there was something about the way the phone felt in her hand, something about the secrecy of it, that made her pulse race. She set it back down quickly, trying to push aside the guilt she felt for invading his privacy. But the doubt had already been planted. Every time Alexander was too quiet, every time he avoided a question, every time his attention seemed to drift elsewhere, that doubt bloomed, bigger and stronger. She wanted to believe him, to trust that their relationship was built on honesty. But now, she couldn't help but wonder, what was he hiding? What was it that made him close off when the conversation veered too close to something personal? And why, despite all the love and affection he showed her, did she feel like there was always something just out of reach? The next day, the phone call that had been buzzing on the table earlier haunted her. She had thought about it all night, but when she tried to talk to Alexander about it, he brushed it off with a wave, claiming it was just a business matter. But there was something in the way he avoided her eyes, something in the hesitation of his voice, that made her question it. He had always been open with her, but now he was withdrawing, inch by inch. The door she had once felt so comfortable walking through with him was closing. It wasn't like him at all. She kept waiting for him to explain himself, to give her the reassurance she needed, but he never did. Instead, the walls between them seemed to grow higher with each passing day. The little things, the vague answers, the secretive phone calls, the distracted silences started to pile up. Isabella tried to ignore them, tried to convince herself that it was nothing, that she was just being paranoid. But she couldn't. It felt like a lie, like something crucial was being hidden from her, and no matter how much she wanted to ignore it, the feeling never went away. That was the first time Isabella started to question everything. She had trusted him, trusted their connection, but now she couldn't help but wonder, was this really the life she thought she was living? Or was it all an illusion? The perfect romance she had built in her head was beginning to feel like a house of cards, fragile and ready to collapse. Isabella couldn't let it go. The unease that had started as a whisper now roared in her mind, drowning out all other thoughts. She had always prided herself on being able to read people, on knowing when something felt off, and this was one of those moments. Alexander's evasions, his secrecy, his inability to truly open up, it was all adding up to something bigger than she could ignore. She needed to understand what was really going on. At first, she tried to convince herself that she was overreacting. After all, he was a busy man, running an empire, dealing with countless things she couldn't even begin to understand. But every time he looked at her with that distant expression, every time he sidestepped a simple question, something inside her pushed back. She couldn't shake the feeling that there were parts of his life that she had no access to, parts of him that were still off limits. One night, after dinner, when they were both relaxing in the spacious living room of his penthouse, Isabella sat down with her glass of wine, her mind racing. Alexander had just slipped away to take a phone call, his voice muffled from the other room. The moment he disappeared from view, Isabella felt a surge of determination. She told herself she wasn't going to snoop, that she wasn't going to break his trust. But then the impulse hit, that burning curiosity, that gnawing feeling that she couldn't sit in the dark any longer. Her eyes drifted to the side table where his phone sat. It was nothing unusual. His phone was always in plain sight, never hidden, always within reach. But tonight, it felt like an invitation, an opportunity to dig deeper, to uncover what was lurking behind the facades. She could hear his voice in the other room, but it didn't matter. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she picked up the phone and unlocked it. The screen lit up with a flurry of messages and notifications, but one in particular caught her attention, an unread message from a name she didn't recognize. Her heart skipped a beat. The message was brief, but the implications were enough to send a rush of anxiety through her chest. It read, "I need to speak to you about Emma. We can't keep avoiding this." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emma? Who was Emma? Isabella had never heard that name before, and yet the urgency in the message was unmistakable. She felt a chill creep up her spine. Was it someone from his past? Someone he hadn't told her about? The message was innocuous enough, but the way it made her feel, nauseous, confused, alarmed, was anything but normal. Her hands trembled as she quickly put the phone back down. She couldn't breathe. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if everything she thought she knew was suddenly unstable. What was this about? Who was Emma? And why hadn't Alexander ever mentioned her? Just then, the sound of Alexander's footsteps echoed down the hallway. She had no time to process what she had seen. She had no time to even think about what it meant. Panic set in, and she quickly straightened up, trying to act natural, trying to hide the storm brewing inside her. He appeared in the doorway with a glass of whiskey in hand, a casual smile on his face. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice too smooth, too controlled. Isabella swallowed hard. "Yeah, just thinking." She forced a smile. "About work. The next big project, you know?" He nodded, but his eyes, those eyes that usually held warmth and sincerity, seemed distant, like he was already thinking about something else. She knew then that the message, that name, had unsettled her more than she was letting on. And Alexander, as sharp as he was, must have sensed that. He paused, his gaze flicking between her and the phone on the table, but then he did nothing. He didn't ask what was on her mind. He didn't push her to talk. He simply took a seat beside her, the conversation moving on to something trivial, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. That night, as they lay in bed, Isabella couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing. She replayed the message again and again, trying to make sense of it. Who was Emma? Why was she so important to Alexander that he would hide her from her? And why had he never mentioned her? Had he been keeping something from her all along? The next morning, Isabella woke up earlier than usual, her mind still clouded with questions. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that lingered, but it was impossible. She couldn't stop thinking about Emma. What if this was the beginning of something bigger? Something she hadn't anticipated? What if Alexander had been hiding more than just his past from her? Determined to find answers, she began to dig. She started with the message, trying to find any trace of Emma. But the name didn't appear anywhere in the context of Alexander's social media, emails, or texts. She scrolled through his contacts and found nothing. Emma wasn't a business associate. She wasn't a family member. She wasn't even a friend. It was like she didn't exist. Isabella turned to other sources. She asked mutual friends, subtly trying to find any mention of Emma. But no one seemed to know anything. It was as if Emma was a ghost, a name that had never been spoken aloud, a presence that had never materialized in Alexander's world. The more she searched, the more frustrated she became. How could he have kept this hidden? How could he have kept an entire person, an entire life, from her for so long? Finally, after hours of fruitless searching, Isabella decided to go further. She found an old article online, a brief mention in a news piece about one of Alexander's business deals. It was a nothing burger, a passing detail about a charity event he had attended several years ago. But there, buried in the background of the photo, was a young woman. Her face wasn't clear, but the caption beneath it read, "Alexander Carrington pictured at a charity event with his ex, Caroline Evans." Caroline. The name stuck in Isabella's mind like a splinter. She knew that name. Caroline Evans had been mentioned once or twice in passing conversations, but never in detail. Isabella quickly opened another tab and searched for more information on her. She found a few articles about Caroline, a former model, a philanthropist, a woman with a striking resemblance to a younger version of herself. Caroline had been connected to Alexander in a way that felt more than just business. Isabella sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. Suddenly, everything seemed to click. The secrecy, the evasions, the missed details. Caroline and Emma. Could it be? Had Alexander been hiding a child from her all this time? Had he been keeping something as monumental as fatherhood locked away from her? A secret buried deep beneath layers of lies and half-truths? The truth, as Isabella was beginning to see it, was much darker than she had ever imagined. The deeper she dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Alexander wasn't just keeping secrets. He was hiding an entire life, a life that she had never known existed. Isabella felt the world around her begin to tilt. The name Emma had haunted her for days, and now, with every new piece of the puzzle she uncovered, the reality of what Alexander had been hiding was beginning to take shape. She could no longer pretend that the strange, guarded behavior, the cryptic messages, the mystery surrounding his past were just figments of her imagination. Something was terribly wrong. One afternoon, after hours of piecing together fragments of information, Isabella decided to confront him. The raw, churning feeling in her gut told her there was no more time to waste in the fog of doubt. She needed answers, and she would not settle for the evasions, the half-truths, or the perfect smiles he had been offering her for so long. This was bigger than their relationship, bigger than trust. This was about truth, a truth she was now certain Alexander had kept hidden from her. It was late in the evening when Alexander came home from a business trip. He was, as always, impeccably dressed, his presence filling the room as he walked in. But Isabella could see through the polished veneer, the smile that barely reached his eyes. He was tired, distant, as if his mind was somewhere else. And in that moment, she knew this had gone on long enough. He had been hiding something, and no matter how much he tried to protect her from it, it was time to face the truth. He set his briefcase down, his phone buzzing softly in his pocket as he stepped into the kitchen. Isabella followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts, trying to calm the hurricane of emotions that were swirling inside her. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was a reckoning. "Alexander," she said, her voice trembling only slightly. "We need to talk." He paused, his back still turned to her. There was a flicker of something, nervousness, guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He turned to face her with his usual calm, cool demeanor, the one that had always been his shield. "What's on your mind?" His tone was casual, but Isabella could sense the tension in his posture, the way his jaw tightened, his eyes momentarily flickering to the side. She didn't give him the chance to brush it off. "It's about Emma." The word hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Alexander's face froze. It was the smallest change, just the tightening of his expression, the briefest flicker of panic in his eyes. But it was enough. Isabella saw it, and it made her stomach turn. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Isabella, No," she interrupted, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "No more excuses. Who is she? And why didn't you ever tell me about her?" For a long moment, Alexander didn't speak. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open as though searching for the right words. But there were no words that could undo the damage. No words that could explain away the lies that had been building between them, one small omission after another. She had trusted him. She had believed in him. But now, it felt like everything had been built on a lie. "Alexander," she pressed, her voice softer but firm. "Who is Emma? And why does it feel like you've been hiding her from me?" His eyes flickered to the ground, as though the weight of her gaze was too much to bear. For a moment, he was silent, a man caught in the web of his own secrets. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he began to speak. "It's not what you think." His voice was strained, as if the words were painful to say. "I never wanted you to find out like this. I didn't want you to carry the burden." Isabella's mind raced. Burden? What was he talking about? The uncertainty in his words only deepened the confusion that had already settled in her chest. "A burden," she echoed. "What does that mean? What are you hiding from me?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his expression lost in thought. "I never meant for it to go this far, Isabella. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to explain something that has been complicated. Complicated?" She took a step closer, her pulse quickening. "What's complicated about it? You've been hiding someone, a whole child, from me. That's not complicated, Alexander. That's betrayal." He winced, his eyes flickering with pain. But still, he remained silent. Isabella could feel the frustration rising in her chest, the anger bubbling up like lava ready to erupt. She had never felt so betrayed, so in the dark about something so important in their relationship. Finally, with a deep breath, he spoke. "Emma is my daughter. She's mine. And her mother was someone I was with before I met you. Caroline." The world seemed to stop. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Caroline, the name she had found in the news article. The woman from Alexander's past. The woman he had never mentioned, not once in all their time together. She had known there was something. She had known it all along. But hearing it out loud, hearing him admit it, made her feel like she was floating, detached from reality. "Emma is your daughter?" Isabella repeated, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "But why? Why didn't you tell me? Why keep it a secret?" Alexander's gaze shifted to the floor. He looked defeated, like a man caught in a trap of his own making. "I didn't know how. Caroline, she and I were together for a long time, but things ended badly. She and I had Emma together, but when she left me, she asked me to keep Emma a secret. She wanted to protect her from the press, from the media. She didn't want anyone to know. Not even you? Isabella's head was spinning. She had heard the words, but they didn't make sense. Why would Caroline want to keep her daughter hidden? Why would Alexander agree to something so strange, so deceptive? And why had he never told her about Emma? I didn't agree with it, Alexander continued, his voice low. But I did. I thought it was what was best for Emma, for all of us. And I thought if I kept it hidden, if I kept you out of it, everything would be easier. That's why I never mentioned her. I thought it was the right thing to do. The words hit Isabella like a freight train. She felt as though the ground beneath her was crumbling. All this time, Alexander had been living with this secret, this child he had never told her about. She had thought they shared everything, that they were open with each other, but this was something different. This wasn't just a part of his past. It was his present. It was something he had kept hidden, locked away, not just from her, but from the world. And now, it had all come crashing down. I don't know if I can do this, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and disbelief. I don't know if I can trust you again, Alexander. His face crumpled. And for the first time in their relationship, she saw vulnerability there, something raw and real. He took a step toward her, his hand outstretched. Please, Isabella, please don't say that. I made a mistake. I should have told you. I should have trusted you. But Isabella stepped back, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. The truth was out, but it didn't feel like a relief. It felt like an ending, and she wasn't sure where to go from here. The truth had torn apart the world she had built with him. And now, she was standing in the rubble, wondering if it was even worth trying to rebuild. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Isabella couldn't look at him anymore. The weight of his confession hung between them, a tangible force that seemed to crush all the air in the room. Alexander had told her the truth, or at least the part of it he was ready to admit. But now, all the questions she had were multiplying faster than her ability to process them. Emma wasn't just a forgotten detail of his past. She was the heart of an entire secret life that had been hidden from Isabella for months, perhaps years. Her mind raced with images of Emma, of this child who had always been there, just beyond her reach. What was she like? How long had Alexander known her? Had he visited her? Did Caroline allow him to be a father? And what about her? Where did Isabella fit into this tangled mess of lies and half-truths? She had been the one he had chosen to be with. Yet here she was, standing in the aftermath of a life she didn't even know existed. Isabella, please. Alexander's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. His hand reached out for hers, but she pulled back instinctively. She couldn't even bring herself to look him in the eye. She needed space. She needed to think. How long has this been going on? She asked quietly, her voice colder than she intended. Her gaze flickered toward the window, the darkening sky outside offering her no comfort. How long have you been seeing Emma? Why didn't you tell me? You told me everything about your past, but not this. Why? Alexander's expression was a mixture of guilt and regret. He seemed to shrink before her, as though every word that left his mouth only dug him deeper into a hole he couldn't escape. I didn't want to hurt you, he said, his voice low. I thought if I kept it a secret, if I kept Emma away from you, that it would protect you. And maybe in some twisted way, I thought I could control it all, control the narrative. I didn't want you to think less of me. I didn't want you to feel like you were just another part of my past that was hidden away. The admission stung. She had always believed their relationship was built on openness, on honesty. But this felt like a betrayal at its core. It wasn't just the fact that he had lied. It was the fact that he had treated her as if she couldn't handle the truth. He had robbed her of the chance to make her own decisions about their relationship. And now, she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she thought she knew. I need to understand, Isabella said, her voice trembling now with a mix of anger and disbelief. I need to understand everything. How did this happen? What exactly is your relationship with Caroline? With Emma? Alexander's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, he seemed lost in the weight of the question. It took him a while to speak, but when he did, his words were slow, deliberate, as if he were carefully measuring each one. Caroline and I were together for a long time. We met years ago, before I ever met you. It was complicated between us, passionate, volatile. We didn't always get along, but we had Emma together. When things ended, Caroline wanted to disappear from the public eye. She didn't want anyone knowing about Emma, and she didn't want me talking about her. So I respected that. At least I tried to. He paused, looking up at her then, his eyes filled with a pain that seemed more self-inflicted than anything else. I thought if I kept her hidden, kept Emma hidden, everything would stay simple. But it never really was. Caroline was difficult, and I was torn. I had a daughter, but I couldn't tell anyone about her. I didn't even tell my closest friends about Emma. And the longer I kept it a secret, the harder it became to tell you. Isabella felt like the ground was slipping from under her. He had been living two lives, one with her and another with a child he couldn't even acknowledge in the light of day. The pain in his voice sounded real, but it didn't make the betrayal any easier to swallow. He had kept her in the dark, kept Emma a secret, all in the name of protecting her. "And you thought I wouldn't find out?" she asked, her voice shaking, as if she were daring him to give a reasonable explanation. "You thought I wouldn't see the signs? Or maybe you thought I wouldn't care about her, that it wouldn't matter?" "No, that's not what He stopped himself, the weight of his own words sinking in. "I don't know what I thought. I didn't want to hurt you." The tension in the room was suffocating. Isabella could barely think straight. She wanted to yell, to scream at him for what he'd done, for what he hadn't done. But a part of her felt something else, a mix of shock and sadness that she couldn't seem to shake. She had trusted him with her heart, her future, her life. But now, all of that felt shattered, like fragile glass underfoot. "Did Caroline know about us?" she asked, the question coming out before she could stop it. The thought of Caroline, the woman who had held so much power in Alexander's life, loomed like a shadow in the corner of her mind. What was her role in all of this? Was she as secretive as Alexander had been? Did she know that Isabella existed? Was she still in the picture? Alexander stiffened. "No," he replied, almost too quickly. "She doesn't know about you. I never told her. I wanted to keep it that way. I didn't want her to think I was moving on, that I had someone else." Isabella took a deep breath, her mind spinning. "So, you've been lying to her too," she said softly, the words carrying a sting of realization. "All this time, you've been lying to everyone, Alexander. You've built your entire life on lies. I never meant for it to be like this," he pleaded, stepping toward her, but she held up her hand, stopping him. She needed distance. She needed space to think, to process. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice steady now, but cold. "I need to understand why this is happening. Why didn't you tell me about Emma when we first met? Why didn't you trust me enough to share this part of your life with me?" He seemed lost for a moment, caught between regret and shame. "I thought if I told you, you'd leave me," he admitted quietly. "I thought you'd think I was damaged. I didn't think you'd understand. I didn't think you'd be okay with me having a child with someone else. But I love you, Isabella. I want you in my life. I want us to build a future together. I just..." "Don't," she interrupted, the words coming out sharp. "Don't say that. Don't say you love me, and then hide something like this from me." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt heavier than any words could convey. Isabella's mind raced with the implications of everything Alexander had just shared. There were no simple answers to what had happened between them. There was no easy fix for the trust that had been broken, no way to simply erase the past. "I need to think," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to process this." And with that, she walked away, leaving Alexander standing there in the darkness of their broken world. The truth had come to light, but it felt like everything she thought she knew about him was crumbling around her. Isabella couldn't breathe. The truth of everything was suffocating her. And though she had walked away from Alexander, the weight of it all followed her, heavy and unyielding. The more she thought about the situation, the more fragmented it became. Like shards of glass scattered across the floor, all sharp edges and no way to make them whole again. Alexander had kept Emma from her, had kept so much from her. She couldn't shake the idea that the lies had twisted their entire relationship into something unrecognizable. As she sat in their living room, her gaze fixed on the window, watching the rain fall in sheets outside, her mind kept drifting back to the moment when everything had shattered. She replayed their conversation over and over in her head, his confessions, the look of guilt on his face, the way he had begged her to understand. But the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. It wasn't just about Emma. It was about everything that had led up to this moment. All the little things he had hidden, all the moments he had kept her at arm's length, all the ways he had protected his own image while keeping her in the dark. She wasn't even sure where to start with him. She couldn't just ignore the emotional hurricane inside her. She couldn't pretend that it was okay, that everything would be fine just because they loved each other. Love wasn't enough anymore, not when trust had been so thoroughly destroyed. Later that evening, as the darkness of the room settled in, Isabella stood up, her resolve firm. She needed answers, and this time, it was time to confront the root of it all. She couldn't wait for Alexander to come to her. She needed to go to the source. She needed to understand everything about Caroline and Emma, from their beginning to their relationship with Alexander. The next morning, she found herself standing outside a small, understated house in a quiet part of the city. She hadn't expected Caroline's address to be in such an unremarkable neighborhood, but as she stared at the house, her stomach churned. She didn't know what she was expecting. Confrontation? Explanation? Or maybe just some sort of closure. She wasn't sure. But what she did know was that she couldn't move forward without confronting the past, without understanding why Caroline had chosen to keep Emma a secret, and why Alexander had been complicit. Taking a deep breath, Isabella rang the doorbell. The woman who answered the door wasn't at all what she had expected. Caroline was older than Isabella had imagined. Her hair darkened with streaks of silver, her face soft with the years, but there was something familiar about her. She was a striking woman, though in a more understated way than Isabella had anticipated, and there was an elegance to her despite the more modest setting of her home. For a long moment, they stood there, staring at one another. Caroline's eyes flickered from Isabella's face to her hands, as though assessing her, trying to gauge her purpose. It wasn't until Isabella finally spoke that the silence was broken. "I'm Isabella," she said, her voice steady but unsure. I'm with Alexander." Caroline's face didn't change, but something shifted in her expression. There was a flicker of recognition, but it was quickly masked by a cool, guarded look. She stepped aside, silently inviting Isabella inside. As Isabella entered, she couldn't help but notice the careful way Caroline arranged her home. It was simple but tastefully done, with little flourishes of personality here and there. A soft throw blanket on the couch, photographs of a young girl scattered around the living room. The photos were mostly candid, taken outdoors at what looked like a park or a beach. And in every single one of them, the same girl, Emma, was there, a child who looked like she had been the center of Caroline's world. "Why didn't you tell me about Emma?" Isabella asked, cutting straight to the point. There was no time for pleasantries, no more polite introductions. This was why she was here. This was what had brought her to Caroline's doorstep. Caroline's eyes softened for a moment, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't want you to know," she said simply, her voice low. "I didn't think you'd understand. I didn't think anyone would. Emma is my daughter, and she's been through enough. I didn't want her to become another pawn in some media circus. And I didn't want you to look at me differently." She paused, studying Isabella's face, as if searching for something in her eyes. "You don't know what it's like living like that. You don't know what it's like to have a part of your life ripped apart and never get a chance to breathe again." I didn't want that for her. Isabella couldn't help but flinch at the words. There was pain in Caroline's voice, something raw and jagged. For a brief moment, she understood. She understood the fear that must have come with being thrust into the public eye, the pressure of being part of a life that was under constant scrutiny. But that didn't explain the lies, didn't explain why Caroline had kept Emma hidden for so long, why she had insisted that Alexander lie to Isabella about her. "But you did lie," Isabella shot back, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. "You lied to him, to everyone, and now you've lied to me. Why?" Caroline sighed, rubbing her forehead as though the weight of the past was suffocating her. "It wasn't always like this. In the beginning, Alexander and I were together because we loved each other. And we had Emma. But things got complicated. We weren't ready for the kind of life we were building. I wasn't ready for a child, and he wasn't ready for a family. When things ended, I didn't want to be alone, and I certainly didn't want Emma to grow up in the glare of the press, in the middle of a scandal. so I made him a deal. I told him we'd raise Emma together, but only if he kept her a secret. I told him he couldn't tell anyone, not even you." The silence between them stretched out, and for a long while, Isabella just stood there, taking it all in. She could hear Caroline's pain in her words, but she could also hear the self-protectiveness, the justification. Caroline had made a choice that had kept Emma hidden, had kept everyone at arm's length. And Alexander had chosen to go along with it. "But why didn't you ever tell me?" Isabella whispered, more to herself than to Caroline. The question echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls, waiting for an answer that would never come. Caroline's gaze softened, and she took a step forward, her voice quieter now. "I don't know what you want from me, Isabella, but I'll tell you this. You're not the only one who's been lied to. You're not the only one who's been left in the dark. All I ever wanted was to protect my daughter, and if I had to do it at the expense of everyone else's feelings, then so be it." Isabella's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She could feel the truth of Caroline's words, the frustration, the desire to protect what mattered most. But it wasn't enough. It couldn't undo the damage, couldn't fix the cracks in her relationship with Alexander. As she turned to leave, she felt a strange sense of finality wash over her. The past couldn't be erased. No matter how much she tried to rationalize it, there was no going back. She had learned the truth about Alexander's past, about Caroline's choices, but now she needed to face her own choices. She had to decide if she could forgive him, if she could rebuild what had been broken, if love, real love, was enough to heal all the wounds that had been opened between them. But as she walked out the door and into the uncertain future, she didn't know the answer. Isabella's heart was in turmoil as she drove back to Alexander's house. The conversation with Caroline had not been what she expected. It had been raw, painful, but there was a certain vulnerability in Caroline's eyes that Isabella hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about secrets and lies anymore. It was about survival. Both Caroline and Alexander had been trying to protect what they loved in their own ways, even if it meant deceiving others. But the question that kept reverberating in Isabella's mind was simple. Could she forgive them? When she arrived at the house, the silence greeted her like an old friend. Alexander was home, but everything felt different now. The walls between them had grown so thick in such a short time. She could feel the distance between them before she even stepped inside. Her fingers lingered on the doorknob for a moment, as if waiting for some cosmic sign to guide her. She had learned the truth, but the truth didn't always feel like a relief. It was a burden, heavy and full of sharp edges, waiting to tear apart everything she had built with Alexander. The man who had been her everything, the one she had trusted more than anyone, had kept her in the dark about something so important. And now, standing in front of their door, she was torn between the desire to walk away and the deep, aching pull of love that still existed inside her. She stepped inside. Alexander was sitting on the couch, his head buried in his hands, his face hidden from view. His posture was stiff, defeated, as though he were waiting for her to say the words that would break him. Isabella couldn't help but feel a flicker of sympathy for him, even though anger still burned in her chest. His remorse was palpable, but could it make up for the lies? Could it mend the fragile bond they had built together? "Isabella," he murmured, lifting his head to look at her, his voice strained. "You saw Caroline, didn't you?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak at first. Instead, she walked into the room and sat down on the armrest of the couch, keeping her distance. Her gaze flickered to the floor, her mind still processing everything. She had seen Caroline's pain, but the pain in Alexander's eyes was something different. It was guilt, yes, but it was also fear of losing her. "You've been lying to me, Alexander," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. "For so long. You've kept Emma a secret, and you've kept so much of your life hidden from me. I don't even know who you are anymore." He winced, as though her words struck him with a force he hadn't been prepared for. He had been expecting anger, disappointment, maybe even heartbreak, but the truth of her words was harder to swallow than anything. It wasn't just about the secrets anymore. It was about the trust that had been shattered between them, and how it could never be the same again. "I know," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I've failed you. I've failed both of you. I never wanted to hurt you, Isabella. But I made so many mistakes, so many choices that I thought were protecting you, but they only kept you in the dark. I was trying to control something I couldn't control. And now everything's falling apart. Her throat tightened as she listened to him, but the weight of everything still loomed between them. His remorse didn't change the fact that she had been deceived. She had been kept out of a part of his life that should have been shared with her, that she deserved to know. How could they move forward when the foundation they had built was cracked? I don't know what to say to you, Alexander, she said, her voice breaking slightly. She wiped away a tear, frustrated with herself. I want to believe you, I do. But everything feels like a lie now. I can't just forget about it. I can't just go back to how it was before. He stood up then, walking toward her with tentative steps. His eyes were pleading, desperate, but Isabella felt a barrier she couldn't cross. It was as if the space between them had stretched to infinity, and no matter how hard he tried to close the distance, he couldn't bridge it. Isabella, please, he said, his voice cracking with emotion. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to keep you in the dark. I just didn't know how to tell you. I thought if I kept it all hidden, we could have this life together. I thought we could build something real. But I see now. I see now how wrong I was. I should have trusted you. I should have told you everything from the start. She closed her eyes, the pain and the confusion overwhelming her. She had trusted him. She had believed in him with all her heart. But the lies, the secrets, the betrayal, they had torn apart everything she thought she knew. Could she ever trust him again? Could they rebuild this? Or was their bond too fragile to survive the weight of the truth? I don't know, Alexander, she said quietly, her voice raw with emotion. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. I don't know if I can just go back to pretending everything is okay. For a moment, they stood there, locked in a painful silence, both of them struggling with the truth they had finally been forced to face. The love they had shared felt distant now, like a memory that was fading with every passing second. Alexander seemed to deflate in front of her, his shoulders sagging as the full weight of what he had done sank in. I'm sorry. I can't undo what I've done, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'll never keep anything from you again. I know it might be too late, but please, don't walk away from me. Don't walk away from us. His words hung in the air like a desperate plea. Isabella wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they could move past this, that they could rebuild, but the damage was deep. Trust, once broken, was never easily repaired. And while she still loved him, there was a part of her that wondered if love was enough to heal this wound. She stared at him, her heart torn in two. She had been through so much already. She had fought for them, given him everything. But now, the future seemed uncertain, fragile. How could they move forward when everything they had was built on lies? I don't know if I can stay, she said softly, the words heavy with finality. I don't know if I can keep going down this road with you. I need time. I need space. I need to figure out what's left of us. Alexander nodded slowly, his face a picture of devastation. He understood. He had to. He had ruined it after all. But he wasn't ready to give up on her, not yet. He couldn't imagine a life without her. But he also knew that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about what she needed, what she wanted. And if that meant giving her the space to decide whether they had a future together, then that was what he would do. I'll wait for you, Isabella, he said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. I'll wait for as long as it takes. Isabella didn't know what the future held, or if there was even a future for them anymore. But in that moment, as she stood in the quiet of their broken home, she understood one thing. Love was fragile. And their bond, once so strong, was now hanging by a thread. Only time would tell if it would survive the strain. And as she walked away, the heavy weight of uncertainty settled over her like a shroud. She had made her choice, to give herself time to think, to heal, to figure out if forgiveness was even possible. But deep down, she knew that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Isabella sat on the balcony the next morning, the cool air brushing against her skin, trying to collect her thoughts. The house felt strangely empty without the usual warmth of Alexander's presence. It wasn't that she missed him, not exactly. It was more that the space around her felt heavy, like something important had shifted, and she wasn't sure how to fill the void that had been left behind. She hadn't given him an answer yet. Alexander was waiting, perhaps holding onto the fragile thread of hope that she would come back to him, that she would choose him over the wreckage of their relationship. But Isabella wasn't sure what she would choose anymore. The world she had known seemed to be crumbling under the weight of his secrets, and she was left picking up the pieces, unsure of how to make them fit together again. It was then that the phone rang, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. She hesitated for a moment before answering. It was a call she hadn't expected. "Isabella, it's Caroline." Her heart skipped. Caroline's voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that knew exactly what it wanted. Isabella had barely thought about her since their confrontation, but now here she was calling again. "I'm sorry to bother you," Caroline continued, "but there's something I think you need to know, something you haven't been told. I need you to listen carefully." Isabella's brow furrowed. The tone of Caroline's voice made her instincts sharpen. She had nothing left to lose, and at this point, she had to know everything. She couldn't afford any more surprises. "Go on," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty churning inside her. "I've kept quiet for too long," Caroline said, her words clipped. "But you need to know that this whole thing with Emma, it's not just about secrets or lies. There's more at play here. Alexander's involvement with me, with Emma, it was never about what you think. There's a hidden agenda that I've kept under wraps, and I can't let you go on thinking this is all just a misunderstanding." Isabella's stomach dropped. What did Caroline mean by hidden agenda? She had already uncovered so much, and now Caroline was implying there was something else, something deeper. "Tell me what you mean," Isabella urged, her voice now trembling. This was a whole new level of deception, and the weight of it felt unbearable. Caroline paused, the silence on the other end stretching out as if she were gathering her thoughts. When she spoke again, her voice was lower, almost conspiratorial. "There are forces at play here, Isabella, bigger than just Alexander or me. I can't explain everything in a single phone call, but I'll say this. There are people who've been pulling strings behind the scenes. People who've had their own agenda from the beginning. This isn't just about keeping Emma hidden or protecting her. It's about power. And I think you're caught in the middle of it, whether you realize it or not." Isabella felt the air grow heavy around her, her pulse quickening. Power? Strings being pulled? Who else could be involved in this mess? "Who are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. She wasn't going to stand idly by while she was pulled into a web of lies and manipulation. "Not again." Caroline hesitated. "I can't say much right now, but you need to be careful, Isabella. If you dig too deep, you'll uncover things you might not want to know. And those who are behind all of this, they don't play fair." The cryptic warning lingered in the air as Isabella stood in the middle of her quiet apartment, the weight of Caroline's words settling over her like a dark cloud. She didn't know what to make of it. Was Caroline trying to protect her? Or was she just pulling her further into a game she didn't fully understand? "What are you trying to say?" Isabella asked, her voice a mix of frustration and confusion. "I'm saying that if you want the truth, you'll have to go deeper. And you might not like what you find," Caroline said softly, almost regretfully. "But the truth is out there, and it's much darker than you think. Just be careful who you trust, Isabella. Alexander, he's not the man you think he is." The line went dead before Isabella could respond. She stood there, stunned, her mind racing. What else had she not been told? What had she been missing all along? This wasn't just a story of betrayal. It wasn't just about Emma's secret existence, or even Caroline's role in it. It was something bigger, something more dangerous. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to feel like fragments of a much larger conspiracy, and Isabella didn't know if she was ready to see the full picture. For the next few hours, Isabella could hardly focus. She kept replaying the conversation in her mind, trying to make sense of what Caroline had said. Her instincts told her Caroline wasn't lying, but how could she be sure? Alexander had been so open about some things and so secretive about others. Was there a chance that he had been manipulated too? Or was he a willing participant in something far worse than she had imagined? She had to find out. But where did she start? Alexander wasn't going to give her any answers. Not now. He was too busy grappling with his own guilt. And Caroline? Well, Caroline was part of the mess, but she was also warning her. There was something about her cryptic message that felt like a call to action, a signal that the real danger was yet to come. The next day, Isabella found herself standing in front of Alexander's office building, her mind clouded with more questions than answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The idea that there were others involved, that Alexander had been manipulated or was part of a bigger scheme, left her feeling unmoored. As she walked through the glass doors of the building, her heart pounded in her chest. She was determined to get to the bottom of this. She needed answers, and whatever the cost, she would uncover the hidden agenda that had been lurking in the shadows. Inside the building, she moved past the receptionist without a second thought. She had no time for formalities anymore. She needed access, and she needed it now. The elevator ride felt long as she ascended to the top floor, the place where Alexander's office was. When the doors opened, Isabella's pulse quickened. She didn't know who she was looking for, an ally, an adversary, or someone who could offer more insight into this tangled mess. But when she walked into his office, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Alexander wasn't alone. Across the room sat a man in a dark suit, his face familiar yet distant. He was a stranger, but Isabella could see the tension in Alexander's posture as he greeted him. This man was important, and from the way they exchanged glances, it was clear he was part of something that involved more than just business. "Isabella," Alexander said, his voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" But Isabella didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the suit. She could feel it, the weight of the hidden agenda pressing down on her, thick and suffocating. Whatever was going on between Alexander and this man, it wasn't just about Emma anymore. This was about something much more dangerous, and Isabella was right in the middle of it. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The game had changed. Now, it was time to play. Isabella barely slept that night. Her mind was consumed with questions, the most pressing one being why everything had started to feel like a game she hadn't been prepared to play. She had tried to make sense of Caroline's cryptic warning, but every new piece of information seemed to only deepen the mystery. What else had Alexander been hiding? And what was this larger agenda that Caroline alluded to? As dawn crept through her curtains, she knew she couldn't wait any longer. The confrontation she had been avoiding was inevitable now. She needed answers, and she was going to get them one way or another. The morning felt cold and empty, a stark contrast to the warmth Alexander had once brought into her life. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she was sure of one thing. Things had changed. She could feel it in her bones. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life around, was no longer who he seemed to be. The betrayal had already started, but what came next was something that would define their entire future, if they even had one. By noon, Isabella found herself sitting across from Alexander in the sleek, modern office she once thought of as their shared space. A place where decisions were made, plans were laid, and futures were envisioned. But now, it felt more like a courtroom. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of their history pressing down on both of them. Alexander was tense, his usually calm demeanor shattered. His eyes avoided hers, but she could see the guilt written across his face. He knew what was coming. "Isabella," he began, but his voice trailed off, as if he was searching for the right words. He was never at a loss for words, but today was different. Isabella took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she folded them in her lap. "I know about Emma," she said flatly, cutting him off. There was no need for small talk now. They had passed that stage. "I know about the child, and I know about Caroline. But there's more, isn't there, Alexander? You've been hiding something much bigger, something I haven't uncovered yet." He looked at her then, his expression a mix of frustration and sorrow. "Isabella, please," he said, rubbing his forehead as if he were trying to stave off a headache. "It's not what you think. You're right about Emma. But everything I've done to protect you. To protect us." She narrowed her eyes, her frustration bubbling over. "Protect us? By keeping secrets? By lying to me? How does that protect us, Alexander?" He paused, his mouth set in a hard line, as if he were trying to control the storm brewing within him. "You don't understand. You couldn't understand. I was trying to keep you out of this. Trying to keep you safe from what I've been dragged into. Dragged into? Isabella echoed, incredulous. You're telling me you've been forced into all of this? You've been lying, deceiving me, and putting me at risk, but it's not your fault? You've been dragged into something? What the hell are you talking about? Alexander's face faltered for a moment before he slowly stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the skyline. He was silent for a long time, and Isabella felt her patience wearing thin. She had come here for answers, and he wasn't going to get away with vague excuses. I've been involved in some things, Isabella, he finally said, his voice low and almost hesitant. Things I can't explain easily. There's a lot at stake. People you don't know. People who would stop at nothing to get what they want. Isabella leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. So you've been playing some kind of dangerous game, haven't you? And I've been your pawn? That's what this is about? This whole time, I've been nothing more than a pawn in your chess game. No, he said sharply, turning to face her. His voice was filled with a mix of anger and regret. That's not it. I never meant for you to get caught in the middle. But yes, I've made mistakes. I've made choices that I thought were for the greater good. But I was wrong, and now it's all unraveling. Isabella's chest tightened as his words sank in. And what about Emma? What about her, Alexander? You kept her a secret for years. That wasn't about protecting me. That was about protecting yourself. Wasn't it? He winced, his shoulders slumping slightly. I didn't want you to know about her. I thought it would destroy us, what we had. But the truth is, she's not just a child I was hiding. She's my daughter, Isabella. My daughter. And the reason I've kept her from you, the reason I've kept you apart from her, it's because her existence is tied to something much bigger than either of us. Isabella's mind whirled. What do you mean by bigger, Alexander? What's this all about? Before he could respond, the door to the office opened, and the man in the dark suit from the day before walked in. Isabella froze, her eyes instinctively darting to Alexander, whose expression shifted. He hadn't expected this interruption. Duncan, Alexander said, his tone cold and guarded. Duncan, Isabella recognized the name now, was a powerful figure. A man who didn't belong in a room like this unless he had some serious pull. The sharp lines of his suit, the confident way he carried himself, made Isabella uneasy. Isabella, Duncan said smoothly, his gaze sweeping over her. I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here. Let me put your mind at ease. It's not just Alexander who's been keeping secrets. I've been involved in this too. The words hit Isabella like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Alexander. It wasn't just about the lies he had told. This man, Duncan, was part of it too. And now, she was tangled in something much darker than she had ever imagined. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice cold as ice. You've been behind all of this, haven't you? You're the ones who've been pulling the strings. The ones manipulating Alexander, hiding Emma. Why? Duncan's smile was calm, almost too calm. You're smarter than you let on, Isabella. Yes, Alexander is involved. But we're not just hiding a child. We're hiding a legacy. A legacy that has a very specific place in the future of this family. And you, whether you like it or not, are part of that legacy now. Isabella's stomach churned. She could feel the walls closing in on her, the weight of the situation suffocating. Betrayal wasn't just in Alexander's actions anymore. It was in the very air she was breathing. This wasn't about love. It was about power. It was about control. And Isabella had been nothing more than a pawn in a game she never knew existed. You lied to me, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. You and Alexander. You lied to me every single day. And now you expect me to just accept this? Accept you? Accept all of this? Duncan's smile remained, but there was a sharp edge to it now. You don't have a choice. The truth is out in the open, Isabella. There's no going back. The finality of his words struck her like a cold slap. Everything she thought she knew about the world, about Alexander, about herself, had been turned upside down. Betrayal wasn't just in the shadows anymore. It was in the open, staring her right in the face. And now, there was no turning back. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back. The days following her confrontation with Alexander and Duncan felt like they had been ripped from a dream. a nightmare, really. Isabella couldn't escape the suffocating feeling that everything she had built her life on was crumbling in front of her eyes. She moved through the motions of daily life like a ghost, unable to find the energy to care about anything other than the gnawing ache in her chest. The weight of their betrayal pressed on her relentlessly, and the fact that she had no control over anything anymore only made it worse. She tried to focus on work, but her mind was elsewhere. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alexander's face, his words, the empty promises. She saw Duncan's smug smile, his power, his cold indifference to everything that mattered to her. But above all, she saw Emma, the girl she had never known, the child who had been hidden from her for so long, whose existence now felt like a twisted part of her own story. Isabella tried to convince herself that she could walk away from this mess, that she could just pack up, leave, and start over somewhere else, far from the people who had betrayed her. But she couldn't. There was too much left to untangle, too much truth left to uncover. She couldn't let them win, not like this. Not when they had turned her life into a game of manipulation and deceit. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Isabella sat alone in the apartment she once shared with Alexander. The silence in the space was deafening, the emptiness almost suffocating. She ran her fingers over the edge of the coffee table, the polished wood cold beneath her touch. She hadn't touched this table in weeks. The little details that had once filled the apartment with warmth now felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else's life. She thought about calling him Alexander, but the idea made her sick to her stomach. She had done that already. She had tried to reach him, to understand him, to find a way back to the version of him she had once known. But every time she spoke to him, it was like peeling back another layer of lies, and each layer made the truth more unbearable. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she stared at it for a moment before picking it up. It was a message from Caroline. Isabella's heart sank. "I know you're angry, but you need to hear me out. This is bigger than you think. The stakes are higher than you could ever imagine. I'm trying to protect you. Please, just meet me." Isabella slammed the phone down on the table in frustration. Caroline, the woman who had been just as much a part of the betrayal as Alexander. Yet somehow, Caroline still thought she could play the role of the rescuer, the protector. Isabella didn't want her help. She didn't need anyone else's help. But then, just as quickly, her anger dissolved into something else, a deep, hollow emptiness. She had no allies left. Alexander was too tangled up in his own web of lies to be of any help. Duncan had made it clear that she was nothing more than a pawn to him. And Caroline? Caroline was just as complicit as anyone else. No one had ever really cared for her, not truly. She had been a player in a game, and now she was left standing alone, stripped of the life she had thought was hers. The tears started then, slow at first, a quiet release of all the tension that had been building for weeks. It wasn't just sadness that gripped her. It was betrayal, rage, confusion. Everything she had been carrying compressed into that moment. She couldn't hold it in anymore. She had been broken too many times. She had trusted too easily, loved too deeply, and now she was paying the price. But in the midst of the tears, something shifted. Isabella wiped her eyes, her breath hitching, and a small spark of something fierce flickered inside her. She wasn't going to let them take everything from her. Not now. Not when she was so close to the truth. The truth about Alexander, the truth about Duncan, and the truth about herself. The sound of a knock on the door startled her. She froze. Who could it be? Her mind raced with possibilities. Caroline? Duncan? Or perhaps Alexander himself, finally coming to beg for forgiveness. But she was done with apologies. She was done with being the victim. Isabella wiped her face, quickly gathering her composure before walking to the door. When she opened it, she found Caroline standing there, her arms crossed and a look of concern on her face. "I told you not to come here," Isabella said, her voice sharp. She wasn't in the mood for games anymore. Caroline's expression faltered, but she stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I know, but you don't understand. This isn't just about you and Alexander anymore. There's more at play here, and I'm the only one who can help you understand what's really going on." Isabella shook her head, disbelief flooding her chest. Tell me? After everything that's happened? You've been part of it all, Caroline. You're as much to blame as he is. Caroline flinched, but she didn't back down. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm not the one who's been hiding the truth from you. I didn't create this mess. I'm just trying to fix it. Isabella let out a bitter laugh. Fix it? How? You think you can fix this by coming here and pretending like you've got some big revelation? Well, you don't. You've had your chance, and I'm done listening to you. Caroline's face softened, and for the first time since their conversation had started, Isabella saw a flicker of something real, something genuine. I know you don't want to hear this, Isabella, but you need to know that there's more at stake than just your relationship with Alexander. There's more at stake than the lies he's told you. Then what is it? Isabella demanded, her voice trembling. She was done dancing around the issue. If Caroline was going to play the martyr, she might as well get to the point. What's the big secret? What's the real reason all of this is happening? Caroline sighed, glancing around the room before meeting Isabella's eyes. You're not the only one in danger here. There's a bigger game being played, a game that involves people with more power than you or I could ever imagine. People who have been watching you, watching both of you. Alexander was part of something much darker, and you were never supposed to find out. Isabella's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Who's behind all of this? What's really going on? Caroline took a deep breath, the weight of her next words hanging in the air. There's an organization, Isabella, an organization with connections everywhere. And they've been using Alexander for years. The child, Emma, she's just a piece of it. She's part of a plan that goes back decades. Isabella staggered back, trying to process what Caroline had just said. What are you saying? That my entire life has been manipulated by some shadowy group? Caroline nodded, her expression grim. Yes, and they won't stop until they get what they want. They'll do anything to ensure their agenda moves forward. The truth hit Isabella like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Emma or Alexander, or even the lies. This was about power. And now, more than ever, Isabella was at the center of it all, whether she liked it or not. Then what do I do? Isabella asked, her voice raw. She was on the edge, teetering between helplessness and the raw desire to take control of her own fate. Caroline took a long, steadying breath. You fight. You find the answers. And you take back your life. Isabella stared at Caroline, the weight of her words sinking in. This was the breaking point. There was no turning back now. The stakes had never been higher. But Isabella knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to be anyone's pawn anymore. She was going to take control, and whatever it took, she was going to end this game. The days after the confrontation with Caroline felt like a blur, but Isabella couldn't deny that something inside her had shifted. It was as if the weight of everything that had been suffocating her had finally lifted, even if just a little. She didn't know where she was headed next, but she knew one thing for sure. She was done being someone else's pawn. She wasn't going to wait for the answers to come to her anymore. She was going to take control. She hadn't spoken to Alexander since their last heated argument. Her phone, once full of messages from him, now sat silent on her kitchen counter. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the urge to check it every 5 minutes. The lack of his constant presence in her life felt strange, but not entirely unwelcome. The ache in her chest was still there, but it was different now. A reminder of a chapter that was closing, rather than something that had the power to define her. Isabella had always thought of herself as someone who was strong, capable, and in control. But it wasn't until she found herself standing in the middle of her apartment, staring at the empty space that had once felt like home, that she realized just how much she had allowed her world to be shaped by others. She had lost herself in the process. She had given her heart to a man who didn't deserve it, and in the process, she had forgotten what it meant to truly be herself. She wasn't sure where she would go from here, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the shadow of what had been. She needed space to breathe, to think, and to rediscover who she was beyond Alexander, beyond the lies, and beyond the manipulation. It was time to heal. The first step came when she called her best friend, Sarah, the one person who had been there for her before all of this started. She hadn't reached out to Sarah in weeks, maybe even months, too wrapped up in her own whirlwind to notice how much she had been neglecting her life outside of Alexander's world. But now, more than ever, She needed someone who knew her before all of this chaos. She needed to reconnect with the parts of herself that had been buried under the weight of everything that had happened. Sarah answered on the second ring. Isabella? Oh my God, I've been so worried about you. How are you? Isabella smiled, the sound of Sarah's voice bringing a sense of comfort she hadn't realized she was missing. I'm okay. Really. I've been through a lot, and I think I need some space to think. I'm not sure where to start, but I want to get back to who I was before all of this. I need to find myself again. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Isabella could practically hear Sarah processing her words. You're stronger than you think, Izzy, but you've got to give yourself some grace. You've been through so much, and it's okay to take your time. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Isabella's throat tightened at the words, a wave of emotion rushing over her. Thank you. I think I just forgot who I was for a while. I let everything else define me, but I'm ready to change that. The conversation with Sarah wasn't the only step in her healing process. Over the next few days, Isabella found herself reaching out to old friends she hadn't spoken to in years. She booked an impromptu weekend getaway to a small cabin in the mountains, a place she used to visit when she needed to clear her mind. Alone with her thoughts, she was able to finally feel the emotions she had been suppressing for so long: grief, anger, confusion, but also a sense of relief. It was like opening a door she hadn't even realized had been closed. She spent her days walking through the pine forests, feeling the cool mountain air on her skin. There, in the quiet of nature, she could hear her own thoughts again. It was as if the universe had given her this space to breathe and to rebuild. The weight of Alexander's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer felt like a constant presence in her life. She was beginning to let go of the anger, the resentment, and the self-doubt that had held her captive for so long. During those quiet walks, Isabella made a decision. She wasn't going to fight for something that had never been hers to fight for. She wasn't going to chase after Alexander, trying to piece together a future that had been shattered by lies. It wasn't that she didn't still care for him, but the version of him she had fallen in love with no longer existed. She needed to love herself more than she loved him. She needed to heal for her own sake, not for anyone else. Returning to the city after her weekend away, Isabella felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She was ready to take control of her life again, to focus on the things that mattered: her career, her friendships, her personal growth. She started taking classes again, something she hadn't done in years. She picked up hobbies she had abandoned long ago, like painting and hiking. She reconnected with her family, who had always been there, patiently waiting for her to find her way back to them. One evening, as Isabella sat on her balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge how far she had come. The pain was still there, but it was no longer consuming her. She could finally see a future that wasn't defined by betrayal or manipulation. The future, she realized, was hers to shape. And as for Alexander, she didn't know what would happen with him. He was part of her past now, a chapter she had closed. The door to that chapter would never fully close, but it no longer had the power to dictate her life. She had given him too much control over her emotions for far too long. Now it was time to take it all back. Healing didn't happen overnight. It wasn't something that could be forced or rushed. But as Isabella stood there, watching the world go by, she knew that she was on the right path. She was moving forward one step at a time, and that was all she needed to know. Isabella hadn't expected to see Alexander again. In fact, she had promised herself that she wouldn't. He was a part of her past now, a painful, complicated chapter she was determined to leave behind. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was a Thursday afternoon when she received the message. It wasn't a call or a text, but a simple email, one that had her heart pounding as she clicked it open. The subject line was straightforward: "We need to talk." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she read through the message. Alexander had requested a meeting, one last conversation, a chance to explain himself. A part of her wanted to ignore it. The anger, the hurt, still simmered just below the surface. She had healed, she had moved on, and she wasn't about to let him re-enter her life. But another part, an uncomfortable, lingering part, felt the need for closure, a sense of finality she hadn't realized was missing until that moment. So, reluctantly, she agreed. She didn't want to feel weak or like she was holding on to something she shouldn't. But as the meeting time drew near, she found herself oddly composed, her mind clearer than it had been when their lives had been entwined. She didn't know what he could possibly say that would change anything, but she was done being a passive participant in his games. The meeting took place at a small, quiet cafe in the heart of the city, a place that once had been theirs. Alexander sat at a table by the window, his face as familiar as it was foreign. He stood when she entered, a polite gesture that felt strangely out of place after everything that had happened. "Isabella," he said, his voice soft, almost tentative. He seemed different, distant, uncertain. Gone was the man who once exuded confidence, the man who had controlled every conversation, every decision. In his place was someone who seemed smaller, vulnerable. She sat across from him, her back straight, her eyes never leaving his. "So, what's this about, Alexander?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. He sighed, his hands resting on the table. "I owe you an apology, a real one, for everything, for the lies, for keeping secrets. I've hurt you more than I ever realized, and I'm sorry." Isabella stared at him for a long moment, taking in his words. She had wanted this, wanted him to acknowledge the hurt, the betrayal. But hearing it now, it wasn't enough. She wasn't the same woman who had stood by his side all those months ago. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and no apology could undo the damage he had caused. "I don't need your apology," she said finally, her voice steady. "I don't need anything from you anymore. I've moved on. You were part of my life, but now, you're just a memory." Alexander's eyes searched hers, perhaps hoping for some sign that he could change her mind. But there was nothing. She had let go, truly and completely. He wasn't her responsibility anymore. "I understand," he whispered, his face a mix of regret and resignation. "I just wanted you to know. I never wanted to hurt you." Isabella gave a small nod, her heart no longer heavy with the past. "I know, but it doesn't matter anymore." With that, she stood up, the finality of her decision ringing clear in the air between them. Alexander didn't stop her, didn't try to reach for her, and that was the moment she knew. She had healed. She had let go. As she walked out of the cafe, the cool breeze against her face felt different, refreshing, liberating. The weight of Alexander's betrayal, the years of confusion, was finally gone. She had found herself again, and now the future was hers to shape. The sun dipped low in the sky as Isabella walked down the busy street, her steps lighter than they had been in months. She wasn't running from the past anymore. She was walking toward her future, ready to embrace whatever came next. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.